Good evening, happy holidays. Yes, it's November 30th, right? It's November November 30th. Warm welcome to you, grace and peace to you. But reason I have the holiday sweater on already is do you realize we only have 2 more Wednesday night classes this year before the holidays, because I don't think we're having class the Wednesday of Christmas week or the Wednesday of New Year's week. So we only have next week and the week after to finish the book of Acts. But here, so we really got to step it up. This is my show and tell for today. You know, oh, Barbara, Barbara left to go to the ladies' class. The rest of you ladies, you're stuck here now. Come in. You're just in time for show and tell. Ready? You ready? There we go. Wait, is it showing up? That's a little, the blinking, what's that?
One fell down.
What? Uh-oh.
No, it's there, but it fell down. It's not on the round outside.
It's in his hair.
The one by your right
On
hand.
your right.
10 o'clock there.
Yes.
Oh, that's stitched in there. It's yeah. So the blinking's a little much then, right? So we'll have to, let's see, it probably shows up best on that one. Yeah. Okay. No, we won't leave it go during the whole class. But I only have then tonight and the next 2 Wednesdays to wear my Christmas sweaters, because on Sunday I have to wear a suit. You know, being the man of God and being the preacher and everything. So, well, I know. I'm wondering where that is. I'm gonna.
Paul started that.
It's in one.
But he didn't wear a tie.
The Apostle Paul.
Class in here on the 21st?
Isn't that'd be the Wednesday before Christmas? No, and then the Wednesday before New Year's either. I'm going to lobby. I lobbied, that we still have our classes those 2 weeks, because I want to teach. I'd rather teach, but I was unsuccessful. So it was Paul that started the preacher wears a suit thing. We found out tonight, and we're learning lots. And but he didn't insist on the tie. Did he make Timothy wear a tie or something, but not Titus or something like that? We were studying that a while back. Well, so we're in Paul's second missionary journey, and I'm in one of those modes where this happened a few times. I think it happened when we were in the Pentateuch in one of the chapters. Maybe it was with Samson or something. I can't remember. Where it just seems I can't get done with that chapter. Erwin asked a question about the Holy Spirit a couple weeks ago, and so I gave a 30-minute lecture on the Trinity. And then, so we didn't cover very much that time, and then we had some other questions come up. And so when I'm rewatching the classes, I'm seeing again how it might be frustrating for you that we're not getting through this material. So let me see what we can do, but I do need to go backwards a little bit. I want to show you a couple things. As I was watching the class, and I'm behind on the classes, I had some health issues as usual, but I had some serious computer glitches, some problems that took a while to figure out and get fixed. And same with these cameras. They've shut off on their own like 3 different times, so hopefully they're going to still record. But when I put these camera views together with the visuals and make the final upload, I rewatched the class, and as I pointed out to you before, I correct things where if I misspoke or gave the wrong reference, that there's something that needs to be corrected, or if I just want to add something, I do that. So I wanted to show you some, since I just uploaded, I finished that yesterday, last week's class, and just uploaded it earlier today. But I mentioned, so I put this text overlay on this image here because I mentioned in class that this was the baptism of Lydia. And then I was just looking at it again. That doesn't look like an adult, does it, that he's baptizing there? How could that be the baptism of Lydia? But I couldn't figure out, and I didn't take the time to go back and find where I got the image. It would have taken some time. And a lot of times, there isn't any information connected to the image, so it can be a really time-consuming process. Yeah, but Erwin's making a good point, right? This isn't an actual baptism, but Yeah, in case you couldn't see it. So I don't know, because if it was the jailer is usually depicted in some kind of official Roman guard or some kind of uniform, being a jailer. And if it's Lydia's household, that's what I was thinking at the time. But then I looked and I said, well, that looks like a child. But that is supposed to be Paul and Silas, I believe. So maybe it is the jailer. It's supposed to be the jailer.
The halo is over their head proves they're
Yeah, you can see, it's a little bit out of the picture, but yeah, you can see Silas's halo a little bit there, right? So yeah, lots of historical inaccuracies. I understand that, but I've qualified my use of these images before. What it also allows me to do is add some little extra thoughts here and there that I wish I would have said in class. What it does is it gives me excuse to quote C.S. Lewis some more. So there's, when I was talking about God cannot compel belief or directly cause you to believe independent of your will. And I love that quote from C.S. Lewis. You've heard me use a number of times. But I realized as I was going through the text, several times I gave the wrong scripture, or I conflated scriptures. I said John 8 and I meant John 5, and I was mixing the ASV and the ESV. I know you guys are right on top of all that. You know when I misquote a verse and you're just holding back. But some of you failed to point out there was a sweet, godly sister in Christ who had the compassion and courage to approach me after class and point out misspelling I had in my slide. So all the rest of you didn't tell me. You remember the misspelling? For 2 weeks in a row I used the same, deceive. Now, so I wanted to show you this quickly. So when I fixed this, or when I made a note of it in the video upload as I was editing the file, I wanted to put like a timpani sound or a sad trombone sound or something, a little special effect to make it sound silly, like, oops, look what I did here. I did that before with another one. And so as I was experimenting with different sounds, I put several in, and then I couldn't figure out how to get them out. And I didn't want to keep messing with it. So listen to how this one, hopefully this will work. Listen to how the final one came up here. So this is from the class. See if this will work. But what they show, you remember at the very end of class, is that God is said to blind people or deceive people. But then I couldn't figure out how to get that boing, boing, boing out.
It's not too much.
Yeah, no. It disappeared from the timeline, I think, because of a glitch or because I didn't have the right settings or something. But I actually said something I wanted to correct, and I want to put this before the class here to make sure you understand. When I was listing the household baptisms, I included Crispus. But it says Crispus. That should have been referred to, that list, as maybe household conversions, because it just says in Acts 18:8, Crispus believed. And then many of the other Corinthians hearing believed and were baptized. But it says Crispus and his household believe. It's synecdoche. It's a summary statement to say that they were saved. They responded to the gospel. And so I added this visual. Now there's a little, I'm trying, you have to find public domain, copyright-free background music, or else you have to pay for copyrights, or you'll get dinged, you'll get blocked, or you'll get, there'll be a problem with your channel that YouTube will flag it for using copyrighted material. I had that happen to me before. So I was just trying to find something that came with the program, and I don't know why there's the kind of haunting flute sound here in the background, but try to read the slide and because I want you to see the point, though, that I was trying to make here. So, sorry, one more that we have in Acts. Later we're told Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue in Corinth, he was baptized. Does that make sense? You see the point that I'm trying to make there? This is a really good answer that I forgot to bring up about the assumption that a household must have had infants, and so anything that was said that household did in response to the gospel must have included infants. Then that would mean in Crispus' house, infants must have believed, because it said he believed with his household. So how would you respond to that? You would say, well, obviously, no, infants can't believe. And exactly. And we would say, obviously, infants can't be baptized either, because they're not. So that's another reason class kind of ground to a halt, because I spent most of the class talking about infant baptism, but I want to make that section of the class, I'm going to make it a separate, what I call a class clip, about infant baptism, and it will be an easy link that you could share if the subject ever comes up. And you can say, well, we talked about that in one of our Bible classes, and you could share that. So I'm trying to make it a useful resource in that regard. So, all right. So we talked about this slave girl and Paul cast this spirit of divination out of her. She was possessed, and I explained just quickly something I poorly explained. It bothered me later when I was watching the class. Maybe I shouldn't watch my own classes again, but the point about the use of that word and saying that she had a spirit of Pythoness, Puthon, I didn't explain that very well, so it was probably confusifying. But the idea is that the word referred to this serpent or dragon that supposedly guarded this oracle who could have visions and such, and in Greek mythology, and it was slain by Apollo. But this is the point. Later, I didn't mention that the word came to designate a spirit of divination, where people claim to have some kind of spirit to give them supernatural insight. And then those who were believed to have such a spirit dwelling in their belly. So that's the word that's being used there. And that explains why then you'll see in biblical artwork the woman's depicted there, as we pointed out, with this, this serpent around her that you can see. I didn't explain that very well. So Paul cast, this is the slide we finished on, Paul cast the demon out of the unclean spirit. I take it this was a demon is the idea. And so we just mentioned at the end of the class that, even though I don't see any evidence that there's demon possession today, or that we have the power to confront demons in that way, still we do face evil, unseen forces of evil that the Bible describes as part of the spiritual warfare that is going on, the cosmic warfare that is going on. All right, I'm not going to keep going back. Let me keep moving here. So the play on words is that when the Spirit came out, I guess I did get to this slide too. The Spirit went out of her that hour, but the owners saw that their hope of gain went out. When the Spirit went out, their money went out too. So that's what I wanted to point out. It's a play on words. So what did they do? They seized Paul and Silas, dragged them into the marketplace before the rulers, and they brought them to these magistrates. So they brought them, notice verse 20, they brought them to the magistrates, and then they make this charge against them. But I wanted to show you something about these magistrates, right? So here is a depiction of Paul and Silas being beaten. And you see standing, or positioned back here, seated back here, is this magistrate. So Philippi is a Roman colony. There were two magistrates that this is one of the most common terms for one of the most common Roman positions, where these are the officials that would be appointed to oversee the affairs of the colony. And they're often pictured with, does anyone know what this is called? The bundle of rods, and often with a blade sticking out of it, and do you know why it is depicted that way with the blade? Authority, doesn't it? Yes, that's right. It's a depiction. You see it in American history. In a lot of early architecture in early America was because of Jefferson's influence, and he wanted our architecture to reflect eternal principles, not something trendy at the moment. And so that's why the Virginia courthouse that he designed, and then our Capitol and other buildings followed suit, they have the big dramatic columns, the Greek columns and all of that. So, so you see this symbolism. I'm going to point it out to you. This is called a fasces. That's where we get our word. What word sounds like that? A fasces, fasces, fasces. That has to do with governing power. Fascism. Fascism comes from that term. So here in New York City, I found, notice, this is outside the district court in New York City. You see the, I'm not sure what goddess or what figure this is that's being depicted there, but this is a federal district court in New York City. And notice though, to the side there, I enlarged it in this picture, you see that's a fasces, or fasces rather. And in Virginia, I used to take people in Richmond to the Virginia Capitol all the time, and there is a stunning work of art of George Washington. And George, this is the only statue where Washington actually had a cast made of his face for this statue. So we know this is exactly what he looked like. He had to breathe through a straw when a plaster cast was made of his face by a French sculptor, and it's an amazing, it is absolutely, if you've seen a lot of other statuary around the Capitol, and then you see that one, you see a marked difference in the quality of the craftsmanship and of the art of it. And so it's, but you notice the fasces? What he has his hand on, everything in the image symbolizes something, even the bulging buttons in his belly, showing he was done with governing and was willing to relinquish power. Even though he was so popular, they would have gladly had him be president for life. And there's a plow behind the fasces because he just wanted to go back to his farm. He wanted to farm. And so we would often take people to that. So there's a picture of the wife with some people, and we would go check that out. And even on the Lincoln Memorial, look at on each side of his arms. So all of that, these were the magistrates. They had lictors or servants that would carry the fasces, and the blade represented their power. That represented their authority to punish. And here's some cool dudes in front of the Lincoln Memorial, in case you wanted to see it. That's my preacher posse, and there you can see the fasces. I keep saying it incorrectly there on either side. So let's look at what happens then. So they bring them to the magistrate and say, "These men are Jews." So right away, there's a racist appeal here, sort of. The Jews were scattered throughout the empire, as Moses said they would be if they forsook God, and because of the Babylonian captivity, the Assyrian and then the Babylonian captivity, they were scattered throughout the Mediterranean world, and so they had their own distinctive communities everywhere they went. That's why we find Paul going into the synagogues when he would go out and preach in Asia and in Macedonia and Greece, etc. But they were often viewed with contempt. And so notice it says, "These men are Jews, and they're disturbing our city. They advocate customs that are not lawful for us Romans to accept or practice." And so the crowd joined in attacking them. Of course, they've done nothing illegal. They have not advocated customs that were unlawful for the Romans to practice.
Customs do you think they could have been referring to?
The only thing I can think, the thing that comes to my mind is later in Acts 19, I'm realizing now it's a bad idea to wear the t-shirt with a dress shirt and a sweater over the top. I'm actually sweating right now. So, is in Acts 19, you remember that what was the concern in Ephesus? Demetrius, the silversmith, said, "Hey, they're taking away from our business here." And so by casting the spirit of divination out, they affected the pocketbook, they affected the livelihood. They were exploiting that possessed girl for monetary gain. And so they might have felt like the message they're preaching doesn't allow you to do what they were doing with that woman, or idolatry, like being opposed to idolatry. That's what happened in Ephesus when they were burning their their books of the magical arts and etc. And so it was viewed as a threat to the commerce connected with idolatry. So that's the only thing I can think of, unless someone had a thought on that. But
The
yeah.
spirit of divination would have been evil spirits, correct?
Yeah, I think that's meant to be understood as the same thing as when Jesus would cast out a demon, and sometimes called an unclean spirit. And there's considerable mystery attached or surrounding the biblical doctrine of demons, but in the New Testament it seems to be the spirits of evil, of departed evil beings. I mean, the spirits of evil men who've died and who are allowed by God to come and occupy a body, or it's possible in cases to have, some would suggest, angelic beings, fallen angelic beings, like the devil and his angels. Hell was prepared for the devil and his angels. Matthew 25, Jesus says to those who are lost, "Depart from me, cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels." So they're some kind of spirit being that is malevolent. And I wish we knew more, something more definitive than that. But it is really frightening when you look in the Gospels at what happened when people were possessed by them, and it shows you the disturbing reality of evil and the horrible effects of evil allowed to run rampant that way. But it shows you, the important point is, it shows you the power of God over Satan and his angels and over all evil, and that Jesus was able to demonstrate his lordship over the cosmic realm that way, which is very important, and then his disciples were able to as well. So so the crowd, but then the whole crowd joins in attacking them, right? So it's like the mob. It reminds me of the Twitter mob today, the social media furor that you can stir up and get people to join in, and then it seems like the whole culture is coming down on something, is outraged about something. So look at the violence. They tore the garments off of them and gave orders to beat them with rods. So let me stop you right there and ask, okay, so what do you see in this? Think for a minute. What are the enemies of God doing here to oppose the gospel? Because it's the same kind of tactics we face today. I've already suggested, we face similar sorts of things today. You've heard me say this several times. Who do they go to? Just like the Jews with Pilate, who do they go to? Government. Yeah, they use civil authority, okay? They want to use the power of the state. So they're opposed to Paul. They're opposed to Paul and the preaching of the gospel for their own selfish reasons, but they're not content to simply oppose them in the realm of ideas by trying to refute what they're saying, by trying to engage people's minds and hearts. They want to use the power of the state. They want to leverage the power of the state to come down against Christians. And we know that's happening right now, right? All over the Western world. And of course, it's happened throughout history. We know that Christians were slaughtered, that they were murdered in horrible ways by governing authorities. And we had at one time a government that was, founded upon the protection of religious liberty, among other liberties. And now we're seeing that being eroded. In fact, just today was it today? Just today that it was passed in the Senate, the Defense of Same-Sex Marriage Act, and it did not have any real, meaningful, rigorous defense for religious exceptions or allowance for religious exceptions. So even though 3 amendments you had 3 senators each tried to pass an amendment. So you had 3 attempts, 3 different amendments trying to provide protections for churches, for people like us, so that so that we could not be compelled by the state to give our property to, say, a same-sex wedding. That sort of thing. But to protect individual Christians too, like Jack Phillips, if you're a Christian baker or florist or photographer, that you could not be compelled by the federal government under this law to use your services to support same-sex marriage. All of those amendments were struck down. They weren't attached to the final bill. And so here's a case where our religious liberties have been egregiously undermined, and we could end up facing prosecution eventually, either as individuals in the marketplace, and people think, well, no, it allows freedom of religion. It has this statement about respecting different beliefs about marriage. And what that means is it's okay for you to have your own private belief as long as you go in your house and close all the doors and turn off all the lights and just keep your mouth shut and keep it to yourself. You can believe whatever you want about marriage because we have religious freedom. But you see, it's in the public realm that religious freedom needs to be protected, or it's really not freedom at all. Yes, you can believe whatever you want, but how does it play out when it comes to religious organizations like adoption agencies? Do they have to allow homosexual couples to adopt children, like Catholic Charities and other organizations? In the Churches of Christ, we have adoption agencies, and we would be opposed to placing children in same-sex marriages. But you could be shut down now, again, by the power of the state. You could be opposed even from doing good because you're not willing to facilitate what the government is being used to promote here. So the use of civil authority, I'm just saying that because look how timely that is. That just happened. That just happened today. And we could give example after example, and if we can get to the end of the chapter, which looks like a dream, but we could. Well, what else? What else? Let me suggest another one to move us along here. They stir up the public, like I said, the social media mob, the Twitter mob, the media gets on board, right? So you have in Acts 19 when the mob is stirred up and they all come into the Colosseum, and it's a very dangerous situation because the whole community now, the whole city is in an uproar. And this is where we've seen, like in Islamic countries, where there's some rumor that U.S. soldiers flushed a Quran down the toilet, which was not true. But then people hear it, and they spread it, and they get people in an outrage and a furor, and they go out, and innocent people were killed by the mob in those situations. And that happened in the Black Lives Matter riots of 2020. And so people stir up the public based on false information and false accusation, and that's a very dangerous situation. But that has been done against Christians. I suppose there are a lot of people who have distorted opinions of our faith simply because of the influence of the media in mischaracterizing us as hateful and bigots. And so that stirs up a kind of resentment and hostility toward people of faith. That's a very serious matter. So they appeal to prejudice. These men are Jews. That they appeal to fear, that we should be afraid of what they could do, what their influence would do to us and to our community. We see, again, I could give example after example. We're seeing this very sort of thing happen right now. If we as Christians dare stand up and say we don't want our children being sexualized in public schools and being taught that girls can be boys and boys can be girls, and being taught about masturbation and explicit sex acts and all of this when they're 5 years old. Oh, you're a threat to children now. There's this idea that you're a bigot because you're opposed to the LGBTQ, teaching children to be tolerant of people who are an oppressed minority. But when the irony is we're the oppressed minority now in our culture, those who are opposed to the sexualization of children, to the mutilation and the chemical castration and the literal castration of children. But you see, people appeal to that kind of thing. They make these false charges. And then ultimately, right? This is what it will come to.
But Tyler,
That's what happened with Christ, and then it happens with his disciples in the book of Acts. So
none of this had to happen if Paul would have just done what we do today and kept his mouth shut, cast the demons out of this woman.
yeah, you know what? You remind me of something. Barry's being facetious, and I don't like that. I'm a very straightforward person, and I'm opposed to sarcasm, Don, and using humor. But no, it reminds me of something an elder told me years ago. He said said this, and I think it was in a Bible class in the church, when Stephen was stoned in Acts 7. You know, when he gets to the end of his speech, he makes some very strong, some very powerful accusations against the Jewish leaders, and he rebukes them sharply, and they murdered him, and actually had a brother in Christ say, well, if Stephen would have just been more diplomatic in how he talked to them, he wouldn't have been murdered.
Same with Paul.
So that's what I'm saying. See, if Paul would just learn to be a little more careful, that, you know, and that's what you know what bothers me? All right, I'm going to say it here.
We do the same. We get in trouble today, too.
All right, that's my point is, you know what bothers me is when you try to get the church to stand up and speak out about these things, you know who gets silenced and who gets chastised? The ones trying to warn us about it. The ones trying to tell us, hey, let's speak out. Let's take a stand. Let's be aware of what's going on. And instead of, we've got Christians who get more worked up about other Christians trying to oppose these things than they do about the actual godless stuff going on. They get more worked up about people speaking out against it than the actual evil that we ought to be opposing. So you get in trouble because you're causing problems, or as a preacher, Tyler's the problem because he's speaking about these things and it offended someone I brought, or offended my daughter, or offended my husband, or my wife, or whatever the case might be. It offended Brother Big Bucks, and now he doesn't come anymore, and he put a lot of money. I use that term all the time. Brother Big Mouth or Brother Big Bucks, and because you criticize something that his favorite political party supports. And so you're the problem, not the people promoting this evil. Those who are trying to say, let's speak out against this, let's take a stand against it, they're the ones that are considered to be the troublemakers and the problem. It's disturbing and frankly disgusting, and I'm appalled by the lack of conviction. But so thanks, Barry. You got me all worked up now. Now I'm angry. I want to break something. No, I'm not. But so what did they do? What did they do when they had inflicted many blows upon them? So they beat them, and Luke just says many blows. I just can't imagine the sound of a rod of being beaten like that. And this is likely what Paul was referring to. I have the text here in 2 Corinthians 11. Look what he says. So he says, are they servants of Christ? He's dealing with people that were opposing him. And he said, I'm a better one. Now he's only boasting because he was being opposed as not being a true apostle of Christ. So he says, all right, forgive me, I'm talking like a crazy man here. He's using sarcasm, right? He said, with far greater labors, far more imprisonments, countless beatings. Paul was beaten over and over, often near death. And 5 times at the hands of the Jews, I received 40 lashes minus 1. So they would whip you with a whip. The Romans would use rods, and they didn't have the restriction to 40 lashes. So, and here's where, this is one of the 3 times here I think that Paul's referring to. 3 times he was beaten with rods. And yet, we don't have the courage to speak out against this perversion and degeneracy being promoted in our culture because we're worried that we're going to lose followers on social media or that someone's going to get offended. That's silencing us. That's making us cower. That's making cowards of us because we're afraid of the disapproval from the world when we're not even facing violence like this kind of abuse and these beatings. It's Paul said, remember in Galatians 6:17, I bear branded in my body the marks of Christ. Can you imagine what his back must have looked like? And then what did they do? They, having received the order, well, notice verse 23, they threw them into prison. So Luke's using this language that it was rough, it was violent. So imagine you're back. They stripped the garments off of them. So that's frightening to me, to think that you're tied to a pole and you have your clothes stripped off of you so they can just beat your flesh to a pulp. It's absolutely horrifying. But then they get roughly thrown into the jail with these wounds, with these injuries. Can you imagine if I beat you once with a rod, you'd probably go to the emergency room and want all kinds of treatment. And can you imagine being thrown around after being beaten with many blows and thrown into the ground in this dark, unsanitary, filthy, dank, depressing inner prison here? Verse 24, the jailer was ordered to keep them safely. So having received this order, he mentions it twice here, he's obeying orders. He's being very careful to go even further to restrict them. He put them in the inner prison and he fastened their feet. And imagine too, being fastened in the stocks all night. And if you have to urinate or defecate and you're just stuck there. And so they're in the inner prison and they're in stocks. So that shows you how severe it was. And I know when I preached on it, I'm going to mention that in a minute. I think I showed some of these. But this gives you a little bit of an idea, perhaps, of their situation. Now, this is supposed to be Paul and Silas being beaten, but I don't think that's accurate because it's showing them being whipped with cords. But I thought it was quite poignant, that it was quite powerful, and just showing the exposed flesh and the marks on the flesh, and it really gives you an idea of the suffering for Christ that they endured. And I showed these to the congregation, then how their hands and feet, perhaps both were in the stocks, or maybe only their feet. But notice how bloodied they are, you see in that image. And remember, it says they were praying and singing hymns. So this depicts them singing and praying. And then this one, even shows a rat there. It's a little bit hard to see with the ambient light in here, but did anyone see the rat? Did anyone see it when I put it on the screen?
Right.
Yeah.
I think there's another one behind them too, with the tail.
Oh, wow. Good eye.
Missed that one.
Wow, so it was really bad. There was just many rats there in there. And of course that made it very painful because it would prevent you from the comfort that a change in position would afford you, right? If you've ever had to, because of surgery, had to sleep in a chair all night. Has anyone ever had to do that? Jack's had heart surgery. Anyone else have major surgery where you had to sit upright or you had to be in the same position all night? You couldn't even turn to one side. Just that is hard, very uncomfortable, very unpleasant, but they've been beaten severely and they can't even really turn over or move. It's just a terrible sight. And it's easy just to read it quickly and pass by it and not think about the depths of their suffering. And that makes it all the more profound when we see them singing and everything. So that I preached a series on this, a 3-part series. I would have much rather have covered it all in class first and then have to endure some of the redundancy, some of the repetition during the worship hour than the reverse. But I do want to work in some of the things we already talked about, so it will be in the recording, so it will be in the class. I take it almost all of you heard some or all of the series, right? So I can kind of appeal back to it. But I called it Joy, the Jailhouse, and the Jailer. And just for the reference of those who, for those who didn't see it, if you go to the League City Church of Christ YouTube channel, that looks like this right now, and there you see our little logo on the left. But just for your reference, just so you know, it was a 3-part series, and it was on the 13th, the 20th, and the 27th. And so those are there. And I couldn't find it. I was looking and looking and looking. And you have to go to even though it's not their archive, it's under the live link. So when you go to the YouTube page, click that on, and then And then you'll see that for the date there, and you can click that on it if you're interested in looking at those. So I know I already discussed this, so I won't go into it as much as I did in those lessons. But let's see here. This is such a profound scene to me. Notice verse 25. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God. It's hard to sing if your spirit is low and if you're in pain. So think of the peace they must have had in their hearts to even be able to do this. And I know I mentioned all this in the sermon, so I'll try to go lightly here. But I just love the idea that the prisoners were listening. Can you imagine that sound, what that must have sounded like to them? Do you think anyone else in that prison had a cause to sing? Wouldn't you want to know, how can these guys cope like this when they're in this miserable condition that we're in this prison, and they're praying to their God and they're singing, and it must have made an effect. So I mentioned how when they went to the hospital and sang for Jim, and that must have had a profound effect on the people listening to these Christians come to a brother in Christ and his family in their time of suffering, and to be able to sing that way. It reminds me of Job says, my Maker gives me songs in the night, that reflecting on the mercy and the grace and the blessings of God and exalting Him, that can be a tremendous comfort. And so that kind of thing, songs in the night, being able to sing in the midst of suffering, be able to have, that was the point of the title of the lesson. And in the first lesson, we talked about how we can have joy even in the midst of suffering. Like earlier in chapter 5, when they were beaten, they rejoiced. The apostles rejoiced. They had just been beaten, and they rejoiced that they were counted worthy to suffer dishonor for the name. And then this text from 1 Peter, I didn't mention in the sermon series, Romans 5:3, that we rejoice in our tribulation, knowing tribulation works patience, and patience approvedness, and provedness hope, and hope does not put to shame, because of the love of God shed abroad in our hearts by the Holy Spirit that was given to us. But the idea is we can rejoice even in tribulation because we know God is doing something bigger in our suffering than what we're having to deal with in the moment, that He's changing us, that He's working in us. And so we have an entirely different perspective. Peter says, do not be surprised. Again, I just want to get this in class, even though I mentioned this in the sermon. Don't be surprised at the fiery trial that's coming upon you to test you, as though it's something strange happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when His glory is revealed. If you're insulted for the name of Christ, you're blessed, because the Spirit of glory, the Spirit of God rests on you. Let none of you suffer as a murderer or thief or evildoer or meddler. Yet if any man suffer as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God. Don't be ashamed to wear the name of Christ. Don't be ashamed if you have to suffer for standing up for the truth of Christ. And so there's a lot more we could say. I love this though. This is the point: is when you suffer, then like Jesus, you should. When you suffer according to God's will, not for doing evil, but for doing right, you entrust your soul to a faithful Creator. You entrust your soul to God. You know that He will bring justice, that He will bring ultimate deliverance, He will bring ultimate vindication, and so you're trusting God to deal with it. So isn't that rich? There's so much to it, and I know we could say a lot more, but I'm just going to rush by this. So what happened then, though? Verse 26, suddenly there was a great earthquake. So there's this great earthquake, and so that the foundations of the prison were shaken, and immediately all the doors were open and everyone's bonds were unfastened. So you think, well, they're all going to get away. I didn't mention this in the sermon, but twice that I'm aware of in recent years, this happened in Haiti. There was an earthquake. There was an earthquake in Haiti that destroyed part of the prison, and 4,000 prisoners escaped. That was in 2010. And then there was one in 2015 in Turkey. So there was an earthquake there, and there were prisoners who escaped because the prison was open. So, this seems rare, but it has happened even in our own time. And so verse 27, when the jailer woke, wait, So the jailer's woke. But he's about to repent, so don't worry. So why would he be asleep? Shouldn't he be alert and on guard? I think you would feel secure, as I said, that in the sermon, that they're all in the inner prison, at least these prisoners that they were told to hold securely, that they're fastened in the stocks. So you'd think, well, I can take a nap here while I'm on duty, and you wouldn't have to worry about that. But when he woke, and so he just sees everything open, he assumes, these stories I just shared, that the prisoners would have all fled and all escaped. And so he drew his sword. You remember, why would he draw his sword to kill himself? Do you remember from what we said? I know you've heard this before in other lessons. It shows him here with his sword about to kill himself. Why kill yourself?
He was responsible.
Yeah, the punishment would be then whatever punishment was coming to the prisoners. You remember later in Acts 27, when it looks like when Paul is a prisoner and he's on his way to Rome in the custody of a Roman soldier, and they have prisoners on board this ship, and he's on his way to Rome, and when it looks like they're going to be shipwrecked, what does the guard want to do?
Kill him.
He said, let's just kill. Can you imagine that? Let's just line them up and kill all of them. Because if any of them escaped, they could be held liable and they could be punished. They could be executed for allowing these prisoners to escape. So they'd just murder them all rather than have any one of them escape. That's how serious of a matter that is. Wasn't there an escape recently, and then here in Texas, and then when the guy escaped, he killed a man and his grandson, right? Yeah. Wasn't that just recently? Yeah. And it seemed very casual the way he was being escorted, the way he was being transported, and wow, it's so he wanted to kill himself. And the fact that Paul intervened is such a powerful thing. Paul intervenes, and he says, and I love that Luke says, the little dramatic touch, he cried with a loud voice, "Do not harm yourself, we are all here," because he's trying to save the man's life, and he ends up saving his soul. And to think that, as I said in the very last lesson, in the third one, by being kind, by showing compassion and concern, even for people who mistreat you. This might have been the man who beat him. He threw him into the prison, put him into the stocks. But by showing compassion even to someone who has mistreated you, you could end up saving him or someone else, perhaps, in that situation. So it's just an amazing account, because here this man was just a breath, was a second away from eternity in hell. Is that close to dying lost forever. And because Paul's immediate concern is for his welfare rather than escaping the prison, Paul steps in and changes his life for all eternity. That's the kind of difference we can make in people's lives. Maybe not that dramatically, but we're around people all the time who are on the verge of eternal suffering, of being lost forever, and we can have an influence in reversing the course of people's life for all of eternity. It's just, to me, it's so profound. And can you imagine the gratitude he must have had for the rest of his life? So he went in trembling with fear and asked what to do to be saved. I'm going to try to just rush through what we talked about in the sermon just to have it in the class. How do you respond when people point out that Paul told him just believe on the, he didn't say just, but people will put the word just believe in the Lord and you'll be saved. And baptism isn't something Paul told him he had to do to be saved. Well, I answered that in the second sermon, and I'm just going to put some of that information here just to get it into the class. And then at the end of the chapter, you see Paul appeals to the government. That's what I want to talk about. He appeals to civil authority and uses the law to his advantage. And I feel like we need to do that today as Christians when our rights are undermined as theirs were. And if we can take recourse by appealing to civil law to protect our own rights as a church or as individuals, we should. So that's a very interesting thing to consider here at the end of the chapter. Okay, we can turn Bob back on. Thank you for letting me cover some corrections from the last class. And
have you ever been in an earthquake?
Just once, and it wasn't severe, and it wasn't really close to where we lived, but the whole house was shaking.
I was on travel. We wanted to hit California.
It's pretty.
When you were building, you could
Just a
make that
moment.
much noise.
Yeah, it's scary feeling, huh? I didn't get to say hello to. Hi, my name's Tyler.